Are you ready for a hard truth that might completely ruin everything your grandfather taught you about early spring fishing? You are sitting on the lake right now, the water is freezing cold, and you are doing exactly what all the magazines tell you to do. You cast out, you let your bait sink, and you do absolutely nothing. You are dead sticking, and your live well is completely empty. What if I told you that your perfectly still bait is not an easy meal, but is actually terrifying every fish that swims by? Today, we are going to look at why your dead stick presentation is a massive red flag in early spring. I promise you, by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why the fish are ignoring you, and you will learn the unexpected truth that will completely change how you fish in cold water. But before we get there, I have a question for you to argue about in the comments. Have you ever watched a fish on forward-facing sonar swim right up to your dead-sticked bait, stare at it for 2 straight minutes, and then run away like it saw a ghost? Let us talk about where this whole dead-sticking obsession came from. It is a concept deeply built into the minds of almost every fisherman out there. The logic seems absolutely flawless at first glance. The water is only 40 degrees. A fish is cold-blooded, which means its metabolism has slowed down to an absolute crawl. Because the fish is slow, the prey must be slow, right? So, the old school legends told us to cast out a jig, or a plastic worm, let it hit the bottom, and pour yourself a cup of coffee. You are supposed to wait them out. You are supposed to offer a meal that requires zero energy to chase. We do this year after year, freezing our fingers off, staring at the line, waiting for that subtle little tick. We trust this method blindly because it has been repeated for 50 years. But here is the problem. The underwater world has changed. Fish behavior has adapted to fishing pressure, and our modern baits do not behave the way we think they do. It is time to stop blindly following the old rules and look at what is actually happening beneath the surface. Picture this scenario in your head. It is early spring. The air is crisp and you can see your breath. You cast your favorite soft plastic rig out to a promising drop-off. You let it sink all the way down into the dark water. And then you do absolutely nothing. You sit there, staring at your line, freezing your hands off. You are practicing the classic dead stick method, just like you were taught. You are told that because the water is cold, the fish are incredibly lethargic. They do not want to chase a fast-moving crankbait. So you decide to give them an easy, motionless meal on a silver platter. But 30 minutes go by. Then an entire hour passes. Your live well is still totally empty. You start wondering if there are even any fish in this part of the lake. But what if the fish are actually there? What if they are swimming right up to your bait, taking a good hard look at it, and then swimming away in total disgust? The reality of the dead stick is completely different from what we imagine in our heads. It is almost never the easy meal we think it is. Let us break down the psychology of doing nothing on the water. When you throw a bait out and let it sit perfectly still, you are making a massive assumption about how nature works. You are assuming that a dying or stunned bait fish just turns into a rigid piece of stone on the bottom of the lake. But think about real life in the wild. Have you ever seen a dying minnow or a frozen crawfish just sit absolutely motionless like a plastic toy? Of course you have not. Even in the coldest water imaginable, a dying creature is still a living creature. It breathes, it twitches, its gills flare, its fins quiver faintly. There is always some sign of life. When your heavy chunk of plastic sits there doing absolutely nothing for 5 straight minutes, it stops looking like an easy meal. Instead, it starts looking like a piece of debris. A predator fish relies on tiny visual cues to confirm that what it is about to eat is actually organic food. By dead sticking completely, you are stripping away every single cue that screams food to a bass or a walleye. Now, let us talk about the visual inspection that happens in early spring. During this time of the year, before the big algae blooms happen, the water in most lakes and rivers is usually crystal clear. You might have 10 or 15 feet of visibility. Because the water is so clear and the fish are moving slowly, they have all the time in the world to inspect your bait. In the summer, a fish reacts on pure instinct. They see a flash, they strike fast, and they ask questions later. But in 40-degree water, they do not rush. They swim up to your bait slowly. They hover over it. They look at it with a magnifying glass. When you dead stick, you are giving them the ultimate opportunity to find the flaws in your presentation. They can see the hook point. They can see the unnatural shine of the plastic. They can see the thick fluorocarbon line tied to the eyelet. Because the bait is not moving, there is no blur of motion to hide all these unnatural details. You are essentially letting the fish read the barcode on your lure. We need to address the problem of unnatural posture. Think about what happens when a standard plastic worm or a bulky jig lands on the bottom of the lake. It sinks like a rock, hits the mud, and often falls over on its side. If you just let it sit there, it looks completely dead and totally unnatural. A real crawfish does not lie on its side in the mud for 10 minutes. A real baitfish does not rest perfectly horizontal with its tail jammed into the dirt. When you dead stick without thinking about your bait profile, you are presenting an object that looks totally out of place. Modern bass and walleye have seen millions of lures. They are conditioned to recognize danger. An object that falls quickly, crashes into the bottom, and then turns into a statue is highly suspicious. To a pressured fish, this does not look like a cold, helpless minnow. It looks exactly like a trap. They will often swim over, nose down on it, realize it looks stiff and fake, and then slowly back away into the depths. Let us talk about what your line is actually doing while you think you are dead sticking. You might believe your bait is sitting perfectly still, but that is almost never true. Think about the wind blowing across the surface of the lake. Think about the tiny ripples hitting the side of your boat. Think about your own hands shivering in the cold morning air. Every single one of these factors puts tension on your line. Even if you have slack in the line, the water currents are pushing and pulling that fluorocarbon or braid. This causes your bait to do something completely unnatural. Instead of sitting still, it is often being dragged slowly and stiffly across the bottom. It slides without its appendages moving. Imagine a plastic crawfish sliding sideways across the rocks without moving its claws. That does not look like a cold creature. That looks like a ghost. This stiff, unnatural dragging motion is one of the biggest reasons early spring fish get spooked. You think you are doing nothing, but you are actually sending a terrifying signal. There is a massive difference between fishing slow and fishing dead. This is where the old school advice really fails us. When the legendary fishermen of the past talked about slowing down, they meant you should be deliberate. They meant you should not be burning a spinnerbait under the surface. But over the years, that advice got twisted into meaning you should do absolutely nothing. Fishing slow means moving the bait inches at a time, but keeping it alive. It means letting it rest, but giving it a tiny pulse every few seconds. Fishing dead means giving up all control to the environment. When you fish dead, you are relying entirely on blind luck. You are hoping a fish swims by, happens to be completely starving, and is desperate enough to eat a lifeless chunk of rubber. In modern lakes with heavy fishing pressure, that almost never happens. The fish are too smart. You have to bridge the gap between keeping the bait in the strike zone for a long time and making sure it still looks like a living, breathing organism. We really need to consider the lateral line of the fish. As fishermen, we talk about the lateral line all the time, but we often forget how it actually works. A fish uses its lateral line to detect water displacement and vibration. This is how they hunt in dark water or at night. Even in clear water, they rely heavily on feeling the presence of their prey. A living creature constantly displaces water. A breathing bluegill pushes water with its gills and fins. A cold, lethargic crawfish still shifts its weight on the rocks. But a completely dead-sticked piece of plastic displaces zero water. It emits absolutely no vibration. To a predator using its lateral line, your bait simply does not exist. It is a ghost. The fish might see it with its eyes, but its lateral line is telling its brain that there is nothing alive there. This creates a sensory conflict for the fish. It sees something that looks like food, but it feels nothing. When fish experience sensory conflict, their survival instinct takes over, and that instinct tells them to swim away. Let us talk about the concept of breathing baits. If you are going absolutely insist on leaving your bait in one spot for a long period of time, you cannot use stiff plastics. This is a trap so many guys fall into. They will throw a thick, heavily salted tube or a dense plastic creature bait and just let it sit. Those materials require heavy movement from the rod tip to actually have any action. If you want to fish incredibly slow in early spring, you need baits that move water all by themselves. You need materials like marabou, rabbit hair, or extremely soft plastics with fine ribs. Think about a hair jig. Even when you are holding the rod perfectly still, the natural underwater currents are constantly opening and closing the hairs. The bait breathes. It looks alive without you having to do anything. This is the secret to successful slow fishing. You let the natural elements provide the micro movements. But if you try to dead stick a stiff piece of plastic, you are just showing them a chunk of garbage. Here is a situation you have probably experienced. You are out on the water, the sun is just coming up, and you cast your jig into 3 feet of water near a laydown. You let it sit there. You are watching your line like a hawk. Suddenly, you see a massive shadow cruise out from the branches. A huge bass stops right over your bait. Your heart is pounding in your chest. You hold your breath and keep the rod perfectly still, praying she eats it. She tilts her head down, inspects it for 10 seconds, and then casually turns around and swims back into the tree. Why did she do that? Because you failed the final test. That bass was curious. She came out to investigate a potential meal, but when she got there, the meal did nothing. It did not try to flee. It did not quiver in fear. It showed 0 signs of life. In nature, prey does not just sit still when a giant predator is breathing down its neck. By refusing to move the bait even a fraction of an inch, you convinced that bass that your lure was a fake. This brings us to the heartbeat quiver technique. This is the adjustment you need to make right now to stop scaring these early spring fish. Instead of dead sticking, you need to start pulse sticking. When your bait is sitting on the bottom, do not move the bait forward. Do not drag it. Instead, you want to leave a tiny bit of slack in your line and just tap the blank of your fishing rod with one single finger. Just tap it gently once or twice. What this does is send a microscopic shockwave down the line. The bait does not move from its spot on the bottom, but the appendages just barely shudder. It looks exactly like a dying minnow taking its last breath, or a cold crawfish twitching its claws in defense. It is an incredibly subtle movement, but to a fish looking at it from 3 feet away, it is the ultimate trigger. That tiny quiver confirms to the predator that the object is alive, vulnerable, and completely unable to escape. It turns curiosity into a violent predatory reaction. Let us look at the scent washout effect. A lot of guys rely on heavily scented baits in the early spring. They use garlic, coffee, or baitfish sprays, thinking the scent will draw fish from miles away. The idea is to cast it out, dead stick it, and let the scent create a cloud. But the reality of fluid dynamics underwater is a bit different. If you drop a scented bait into totally still water and leave it there, the scent does release, but it stays highly concentrated in a tiny bubble right around the bait. If you do not move the bait at all, you are not dispersing that scent trail. You are not pulling the scent through the water column to catch the attention of cruising fish. And worse, after a few minutes of sitting in one exact spot, the plastic can start to wash out. By giving your bait tiny subtle hops or drags every 30 seconds, you are actively painting a scent trail across the bottom. You are leaving a path for the fish to follow. Dead sticking just leaves a puddle of scent that nobody can find. We also need to consider the bottom composition when you are trying to fish slow. In early spring, a lot of the lake bottom is covered in dead, rotting vegetation from the previous winter. There is a thick layer of muck, slime, and decayed leaves down there. When you cast a heavy bait out and just let it sit, what do you think happens? It sinks straight into that black muck. It completely disappears. You might be dead sticking in the best spot on the whole lake, but your lure is buried 2 inches deep in rotting leaves. A fish could swim right over it and never even see it. This is why a totally motionless presentation is so dangerous. You have no idea if your bait is actually visible. By adding slight movements, you keep the bait elevated above the silt. You knock the debris off your hooks. You ensure that when a hungry fish finally does cruise by, your presentation is actually out in the open where it can be seen and eaten, rather than hiding in the mud like a lost coin. Think about the concept of predator and prey dynamics. In any wild environment, movement triggers instinct. Even a cat playing with a toy mouse gets bored if the toy stops moving. As soon as you twitch the string, the cat pounces. Fish are exactly the same way. They are hardwired by millions of years of evolution to react to fleeing or struggling prey. When you dead stick, you are asking the fish to make a conscious, logical decision to eat a piece of stationary food. Fish are not logical creatures. They are instinctual creatures. They do not want to think about their food. They want to react to it. When a cold, lethargic bass sees a bait just sitting there, it takes too much brain power to figure out what it is. But the moment you make that bait twitch, hop, or vibrate, you bypass the thinking part of the fish's brain and directly trigger its kill response. You force the fish to open its mouth before it even realizes what it is doing. That is the magic you lose when you do nothing. Let us break down the idea of fishing pressure again, because it is more important now than ever before. Go back 30 or 40 years. The fishermen back then could dead stick a piece of plastic and catch monsters all day long. Why? Because the fish had never seen plastic before. A purple worm sitting on the bottom was an absolute novelty. But today, fish in public waters see thousands of baits every single week. They have been caught, released, and educated. They know what a motionless stick bait looks like. It is a shape they associate with danger and being pulled out of the water. If you present your bait the exact same way every other guy on the lake does, you are going to get the exact same terrible results. To trick a modern, highly educated fish, you have to show them something different. You have to show them life. You have to break the pattern of the dead stick and give them a presentation that demands attention. You have to act like a puppeteer, breathing life into the rubber. I want you to really think about water temperature gradients. In the early spring, the water temperature is not the same everywhere. The northern bays might be 45 degrees, while the main lake is 39 degrees. The shallow rocks absorb heat from the sun and warm the surrounding water. Fish are actively seeking out these slightly warmer pockets because it helps speed up their metabolism. When they get into these warmer zones, they are actually ready to feed. They are looking for action. If you take your bait, drag it into a warm pocket where active fish are hunting, and then you just dead stick it, you are throwing away your biggest advantage. You are treating active, hungry fish like they are frozen solid. You are offering a boring presentation to a fish that is actively looking to chase something down. You have to match your presentation to the mood of the fish. And if you found the warm water, you need to keep your bait moving to capitalize on their aggressive feeding mood. Another massive issue with dead sticking is losing contact with your bait. When you just let your lure sit there on a slack line, you are entirely disconnected from what is happening at the end of your rod. You cannot feel the subtle changes in the bottom. You cannot feel if you are wrapped in a tiny piece of moss. And most importantly, you cannot feel the lightest bites. In cold water, a fish does not always hit the bait like a freight train. Often, they just suck it in and hold it. If you are dead sticking with slackline, a fish could pick up your bait, chew on it, realize it is fake, and spit it back out without you ever feeling a single thing. You will just reel in 10 minutes later and see your plastic is torn. By keeping a tight line and constantly imparting micro-movements, you remain in constant contact with the lure. You will feel that sudden weightlessness. You will feel that tiny tick. You will be ready to set the hook the instant a fish makes a mistake. Let us talk about the visual contrast of motion. In a cold, quiet underwater environment, almost everything is sitting still. The weeds are dead, the rocks are stationary, and the bait fish are huddled up, not moving much. If your bait is also sitting perfectly still, it completely blends into the background. It offers zero contrast to the environment. It becomes camouflage. If you want a fish to travel 10 feet out of its way to eat your lure, you have to give it a reason to notice it. A slow, methodical drag on the bottom kicks up tiny puffs of silt. A slight shake of the rod tip flashes the belly of the bait. These tiny visual disturbances stand out like a flare in the dark. They tell the fish that something different is happening over here. By dead sticking, you are just adding another unmoving object to an already dead and unmoving underwater landscape. You have to be the one thing in their field of vision that stands out as an easy target. We need to rethink the whole concept of lethargic fish. Yes, cold water slows down a fish. Yes, they will not chase a topwater frog in March. But lethargic does not mean completely comatose. Bass and walleye are still apex predators. Even when they are cold, they are built to kill. They are opportunistic feeders. If a high-protein meal comes twitching past their face, their predatory instincts will override their lethargy. It is an automatic biological response. The problem is that a dead-sticked bait does not look like a high-protein meal. It looks like garbage. When you finally understand that cold fish are still willing to bite if provoked, your entire strategy changes. You stop waiting for them to decide to eat, and you start forcing them to react. You use pauses to keep the bait in the strike zone, but you use movement to pull the trigger. You become a proactive fisherman instead of a reactive fisherman. Imagine the difference in confidence when you know your bait is working for you. When you are dead sticking, your mind starts to wander. You get bored. You start looking at your phone. You lose focus. When a bite finally does happen, you are usually caught totally off guard, and you miss the fish. But when you are actively managing your presentation, when you are visualizing the bait moving over the rocks, when you are focused on feeling every little pebble and imparting those tiny heartbeat quivers, you are completely locked in. You are engaged in the hunt. This mental shift is huge. A focused fisherman catches 10 times more fish than a bored fisherman. By abandoning the completely passive dead stick method, you force yourself to pay attention. You start noticing the subtle signs. You start feeling the tiny transitions in the bottom composition. You become a significantly better angler just by keeping your hands and your mind moving instead of freezing up. So, it is time to put it all together and change your mindset for your next early spring trip. The dead stick is a myth that needs to be buried. Doing absolutely nothing is the most unnatural thing you can do on the water. It provides no vibration, it looks stiff and fake, it gets buried in the mud, and it gives highly pressured fish too much time to spot the trap. You need to transition from dead sticking to controlled slow motion. Use baits that breathe on their own like hair jigs. Keep tension on your line. Impart tiny shudders and twitches to mimic a dying creature. Kick up little puffs of silt to draw attention. Remember that your job is to convince a cautious cold predator that it is looking at a vulnerable living organism. You are the puppeteer. The rod is your tool to breathe life into the bait. Stop hoping for a random bite and start using movement to trigger violent, instinctual strikes. Your early spring catch rate will skyrocket once you stop doing nothing. To wrap this all up, we have to realize that blindly following the old rules is often exactly what keeps our live wells empty. Yes, the water is cold in the early spring. Yes, the fish are moving slower than usual. But the biggest plot twist of all is that by trying to make things easy for the fish, by dead sticking and doing absolutely nothing, you are actually presenting the most terrifying, unnatural, and suspicious bait possible. You are giving pressured fish every single excuse to swim away. By adding tiny, subtle signs of life, by keeping tension on your line, and by giving that bait a heartbeat, you flip the switch from caution to pure predatory instinct. That is the secret to dominating in cold water. Thank you so much for watching and hanging out with me today. If this video made you rethink your early season strategy, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps out. Now, I want to hear from you. Head down to the comments and tell me, what is your absolute go-to early spring bait? And after watching this, are you going to let it sit, or are you going to keep it moving?